From land battles that shifted the war's momentum to naval clashes that redefined control of the Great Lakes, 1813 was a roller coaster of triumphs and defeats for both sides of the war. We'll explore the construction of the American fleet on Lake Erie and the crucial battle on its waters under the command of Oliver Hazard Perry. But we'll also delve into the complexities of the British side, the struggles of Robert Heriot Barclay, and the iconic figure of Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who fought valiantly for his people. Get ready for dramatic twists and turns as we uncover the events that led to the Battle of the Thames and the strategic maneuvers and fateful clashes in the Chateauguay campaign. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends, Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. The entirety of 1813 was tumultuous for both sides during the War of 1812. The year essentially started with the British taking the American town of Ogdensburg as a means to settle a personal grudge between officers, while the Americans started campaign season with a shot at the jugular, sacking the capital of Upper Canada, York. The late spring would see the Americans defeated at Stony Creek, and the heroics of Laura Secord prevented an American surprise attack at Beaver Dams. There was the raid on Black Rock, the U.S. victory at Goose Creek, and a British attempt to recapture Fort George. However, 3 separate battles over the span of 7 weeks across all the fronts of the war would set the stage for a winter of discontent for the Americans. The Great Lakes were the scene for a number of naval battles during the War of 1812. These, however, weren't like what you imagine when picturing naval warfare in the early 19th century. These weren't massive ships of the line like the ones commanded by Nelson. The ships that took part could really be classed into 4 separate classes. There were sloops of war, which were classified by the Royal Navy as warships. These were the biggest ships seen on the lakes on a regular basis and had a single gun deck with around 18 guns. Slightly smaller than the sloops of war were the brigs. These 2-masted ships were more maneuverable than sloops and had between 10 to 18 guns. Then the schooners. Small, nimble ships known for speed. They could be equipped with anywhere from 1 to 15 guns. The smallest class of ship on the lakes that were part of the navies were the bateaux. These were shallow draft, flat-bottomed crafts that were like a canoe, but used sails. They were used primarily for transporting men, used as landing craft, and if they were built sturdy enough, could support a gun or two. At the start of the War of 1812, the British would use their naval superiority to take control of the Great Lakes, while the Americans could use the size of the lakes to make some moves relatively unnoticed, or at least not noticed until it was too late. The British had the upper hand, including on Lake Erie. Now, the Americans wanted control of that lake. If they did, they would have ease of access to ferry troops between the Northwest Front, near what is now Michigan, to the Niagara Front. They could also launch across the lake towards Upper Canada at will. Most of the ships the Americans had were stationed at Black Rock, near Fort Erie at the Niagara River. Fort Erie, though, and the docks nearby were controlled by the British. The Americans at Black Rock were essentially boxed in. They would need to find an alternate way to get a naval presence on the lake. Daniel Dobbins was a lake mariner, and he had a plan. At the outset of the war, he suggested to the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Paul Hamilton, a second base should be established on Lake Erie. He proposed the base should be in the Bay of Presque Isle, near Erie, Pennsylvania. Hamilton agreed and tasked Dobbins with setting up the base and shipyards there. In September of 1812, the work started to cut the trees for the timber needed for the ships, and Ebenezer Crosby, a master shipwright, was brought to Presque Isle to help build the ships. Then a new Secretary of the Navy, William Jones, would order for 2 corvettes to be built along with the gunboats, and another shipwright was sent to assist, coming from Sackett's Harbor. Then, by March of 1813, Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry was appointed to the command of the naval forces on Lake Erie. In May of that year, after the capture of Fort George by the Americans, the British withdrew their troops from Fort Erie, and this move opened up the port at Black Rock, allowing the ships there to leave, and they headed straight for Presque Isle. Even if the British decided to take Fort Erie back, the American Navy was now out and free along the waters of Lake Erie. While the Americans were preparing their naval forces for a coming battle, the British were doing the same. Robert Heriot Barclay was the officer in charge and stationed at Amherstburg, near the Detroit River, at the other end of Lake Erie from Black Rock. Barclay, when first arriving, realized his resources were severely lacking. In terms of manpower, he had 7 seamen, 108 provincial marine officers, and there were also 160 British regulars from the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles and the 41st Regiment of Foot. He basically had infantrymen to use to crew the ships. The evacuation of Fort Erie also caused problems for supplying the British at Amherstburg. With the Americans now in control of the lake, this meant supplies could no longer be easily sent by water. They needed to take the long overland trek throughout the entire southwestern Ontario peninsula. This proved to be problematic when 2 new ships arrived in Amherstburg. The Chippewa and the Little Belt were built in Chatham along the Thames River and floated down to Amherstburg to finish getting fitted out for battle. This included having the cannons put in place. Now, these cannons were delayed. They were being cast and built in York, and that city had just been sacked by the Americans. Once the cannon were finally completed, they then had to take an overland route of 340 kilometers. While the Navy was having issues, the commanding officer of the Army in Amherstburg was in a similar situation in terms of his supplies and manpower. He wanted to be able to launch an attack on Presque Isle, but didn't have the troops to be able to take on over 2,000 American militia who were stationed there. The events on the lake started out with a British blockade of Presque Isle, and this was to prevent the Americans from launching their newly built squadron. Barclay would move his ships into position on July 20th. But sandbars in the area, which would see the depth of the water as shallow as 5 feet in some places, meant they weren't able to actually launch an attack, so a blockade was all they could do. So, less than 10 days after setting up, the British left on July 29th. Officially, this was due to an issue with supplies and coming bad weather. However, even after 200 years, it is believed that this was a lie fabricated by Barclay. Now, why would he lie? Well, there are 2 reasons. First, Barclay left early to attend a banquet being held in his honor in Amherstburg. And second, he didn't want to conduct a blockade. He wanted to defeat the Americans in a battle, and had spent the 9 days hoping they would come out over the sandbar and take on the British Navy. Of course, once Barclay and the British squadron left, the Americans took the opportunity and started out over the sandbar. Perry and his forces would start to move the ships out, and they would use what were called camels, extremely low-draft boats, to carry the supplies of the ships over the sandbar, lowering the weight of the ships enough that they could travel without running aground. Now, around 4 days after leaving to go back for the party, Barclay returned to resume the blockade, and he found all but 2 brigs of Perry's fleet out of the bay. And he rethought his decision to return. Seeing the Americans starting to sail into position to form a line, Barclay thought caution to be the better part of valor, and he returned to Amherstburg to get another ship, the HMS Detroit, added to his squadron. With the ships of the American fleet now out on the waters, the Americans set out to set up a blockade of the British. Well, kind of. They would sail around the area, and they would be spotted numerous times off the coast of Amherstburg. The Americans established an anchorage at Put-in Bay, which was southwest of Pelee Island, and in a position where they would be able to see and engage British forces if they left Amherstburg, and any ships sailing to Amherstburg would be intercepted. The lack of shipping able to make its way to Amherstburg proved to be problematic for Barclay, Proctor, and the British forces. Given that it would take too long for supplies to arrive over land, the lake was the best route available, even if the blockades were there. The Americans, though, had made it so that the supplies couldn't get through. Over the course of 5 weeks, the supplies at Amherstburg began to dwindle. The troops, sailors, indigenous warriors, families in the area, they were all running out of food. Barclay determined he would have no choice but to set sail and engage Perry's forces to lift the blockade. The morning of September 10th, 1813, the Battle of Lake Erie would begin. The Americans spotted Barclay's squadron and left Put-in Bay, and the two sides would form up in a line of battle, and the combat would begin. The first shot fired from the HMS Detroit at 11:45 a.m. The British would have the advantage of the winds for the start of the battle, and the Americans would take fire for a while before they could reply. From his flagship, the Lawrence, Perry got close enough to open a barrage from his carronades. The other brig in the American line, the Niagara, was unable to get into position to join the battle itself, and it remained out of range behind the Lawrence. The Queen Charlotte, which was opposed to the Niagara, would see both the commander and the first lieutenant killed in the opening salvos. Determining the Niagara was out of range, the most senior officer gave the order to close in on the Lawrence. The Detroit and the Queen Charlotte were able to reduce the crew of the Lawrence to just 1/5 of what they had at the start of the engagement. When the guns were finally all out of commission, Perry gave the order to transfer the flag, and he set out for the Niagara. He would be rowed 1 kilometer through the gunfire to the new ship. After the surrender of the Lawrence, though, the tide changed to fortune the Americans. The Detroit and the Queen Charlotte collided with each other, and both ships would become unmanageable. Nearly every officer killed or wounded, and Barclay himself was wounded in the collision. While the British were dealing with that situation, they were half expecting the Americans to retreat now that command had been transferred to the Niagara. Instead, Perry took advantage of the wind and fired broadsides at the Detroit and Queen Charlotte while they were tangled up with each other. The smaller British ships tried to flee but were overtaken and captured. The Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, unable to continue, surrendered. Now in command of the lake, the Americans would prepare to again invade Upper Canada, this time from the waters of Lake Erie. Once the repairs were made to Perry's ships, he would use them to ferry American soldiers to Amherstburg and took the town without opposition on September 27th. The Americans also retook Detroit the same day. The British had held it since the very outset of the war. The reason Amherstburg had been abandoned? Proctor had already been prepared to leave the town, even before the outcome of the battle had been known. The retreat happened despite the calls of Tecumseh, who commanded the Indigenous Confederation allied to the British to stay and fight. Given that there were no supplies, though, Tecumseh himself had no choice but to lead his men and accompany Proctor on the retreat. We have touched a few times on Tecumseh in our opening episode of the series about the War of 1812, as well as his relationship with Sir Isaac Brock. Now we're going to take a little bit more of a look at this important figure in the War of 1812, who is the last hope of an independent indigenous nation in North America, separate from the two Canadas or the United States. Tecumseh is said to have been born around 1768 near now what is Chillicothe, Ohio. As a child, he would see his homeland lost to the Americans over several battles. His father, Chief Pakishinwa, would be killed in a battle with colonists in 1774, and his older brother, Chisikau, would die in battle against the Americans in 1792. At the age of 15, Tecumseh attended an intertribal conference. The speakers at this conference advocated for unity amongst all the nations. Specifically, they put forth a doctrine that all indigenous lands were held in common by all of the nations, and no further land should be ceded to the United States without the agreement of all. This would not last long, however, as the United States wanted to negotiate with individual nations, and some chiefs opted to sign treaties with the Americans without the consensus of all nations. Tecumseh became a warrior under his brother, and they would fight to protect their homeland. This, however, would not be a successful struggle. and they were forced further away from Ohio. They would settle in Tennessee with the Chickamauga in 1789. But Tecumseh, returning to Ohio in 1791, fought with the Shawnee chief Blue Jacket, the leader of a confederacy that had been formed to fight off American encroachment into their lands. The Confederacy fell apart 3 years later, after defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and Blue Jacket signed the Treaty of Greenville with the Americans. The treaty would cede around 2/3 of what is now Ohio to the United States, along with portions of Indiana. Tecumseh would become chief of a Kispoco band of around 300 people by 1796. This band would move to various locations before establishing a settlement near what is Anderson, Indiana in 1798. By 1805, Tecumseh's little brother, who would come to be called Tenskwatawa, would start a movement amongst indigenous people along the White River. He urged people to reject the influences of Europe and the United States, to stop drinking alcohol, and more. The following year, Tecumseh and his brother established a town near the ruins of Fort Greenville, and the message from Tenskwatawa would bring people from a number of nations. Other Shawnee, however, did not come to the new town. Instead, they followed Blackhoof, a chief who the Americans considered to be chief of all Shawnee. Now, other indigenous leaders did come, Blue Jacket and Roundhead. As the tensions between the United States and Britain began to rise, Tecumseh thought it best to move to a more secure location. They went up to a place near what is now called Lafayette, Indiana, and established Prophetstown. Upwards of 6,000 people would come to live there, making it the largest community in the region. Indigenous people from a number of nations, Shawnees, Potawatomis, Kickapoos, Winnebagos, Sauk's, Ottawa, Wyandots. The leader of the community, Tecumseh, and his brother worked to coexist with the United States. This would all come crashing down in 1809 with the signing of the Treaty of Fort Wayne. This treaty, negotiated by William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, would see around 3 million acres of land purchased by the United States from indigenous people. The problem was, those who were using the land were never consulted about these negotiations, and steps were actually taken to keep them excluded from the negotiations. In August of 1810, Tecumseh would meet with Harrison at the capital of Indiana Territory, Vincennes. Tecumseh demanded that the Treaty of Fort Wayne be rescinded, and that the chiefs who had signed the treaty without consulting anyone be punished. Harrison retorted the indigenous people didn't own the land in common because they weren't a nation. The meeting ended with Tecumseh demanding the terms be sent to President James Madison, telling Harrison that if the terms were not accepted, it would mean there would be war. Tecumseh then started to put together his confederacy. He started in the west and even went to Upper Canada and asked the British for support. The British, however, were non-committal at that point. He then went to Ohio and even sent a delegation to speak with the Iroquois. In July of 1811, nearly a full year after their first encounter, Tecumseh went back to Vincennes and told Harrison he had already assembled a confederacy of the northern nations, and he was now going to go to the south to recruit more. He would be aided thanks to 2 natural events: the Great Comet of 1811 and the New Madrid earthquake. These were seen as omens that the Confederacy would succeed. Knowing that Tecumseh was not at Prophetstown, though, due to his travels to gain more recruits, Harrison set out to take advantage of the situation. He marched 1,000 men from Vincennes to the town. Now, the warriors from Prophetstown would launch a surprise attack on the American forces, but this failed. The town was evacuated, and Harrison had the village burned to the ground in the aftermath of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The town would be rebuilt, with Tecumseh gathering around 800 warriors in the village when the War of 1812 started. He would have more than 3,500 warriors at his disposal throughout the American Northwest Territory. At the outset of the war, Tecumseh took his men to Amherstburg, where his warriors played an instrumental role in the early battles of the war. Isaac Brock and Tecumseh would work together to come up with the ingenious ruse to take Detroit with barely a shot being fired, and the Americans became so shaken by the fact they would have to go up against indigenous warriors so frequently. We now come back to the autumn of 1813 and the retreat from Amherstburg. When the decision was made to retreat from the town, Tecumseh told the British commander Proctor, quote, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is his will, we wish to leave our bones upon them. Procter promised to make a stand at Chatham, and the British destroyed Fort Malden and took anything that could help the advancing American army, which was headed up by Tecumseh's old nemesis, William Henry Harrison. The British forces headed for Chatham ahead of Tecumseh's men. Now, when Tecumseh arrived, he found that the British had gone even further up the Thames and were actually preparing to make their stand at Moraviantown. Tecumseh was angered at this cowardice being displayed by Procter. It is a reasonable expectation that Tecumseh thought the man inferior in every respect when compared to his friend Isaac Brock. The American advance was held at Chatham in a rearguard action led by Tecumseh, where the chief was wounded. The indigenous forces retreated, falling back to Moraviantown, but the number of men dwindled as many deserted during the retreat. Tecumseh was now left with just 500 men under his command. Things would culminate in the Battle of the Thames on October 5th. Harrison approached with around 3,500 men, plus another 1,000 volunteer cavalry under the command of Richard Mentor Johnson. The British were outnumbered by around 3-1. Procter had 800 men from his 41st Regiment, as well as the sailors who had been serving on Barclay's ships, and Tecumseh had his 500. The British were demoralized. They were put onto half rations and were frustrated with the leadership of Procter. As the sun rose on October 5th, Procter gave the order to his men to fall back another 2 miles and place them into a line with a single 6-pound cannon as support. He was hoping to use the cannon to push the Americans off the road, trapping them between it and the river. No defensive works were even considered or put in place, even though the British had about 3 days to prepare before the Americans arrived. Tecumseh lined his men along the right of the British line, hoping to flank the Americans. If the British and their indigenous allies were able to hold this ground, it would be a tactical miracle, with the strategies employed studied to no end on how to successfully hold off a much larger force. In fact, with how he drew up his forces, it seemed like Procter wanted to recreate his own personal Thermopylae. Instead, it was a futile last stand. Harrison ordered a frontal attack on the British line by mounted riflemen. The indigenous warriors opened fire on the flank of the Americans, but this did not keep the riflemen back. The British themselves fired off one volley, and the line broke, retreating in disorder. Procter himself led the retreat, as he and around 250 men sought to get as far away from the battle as possible. The rest of the British men threw down their weapons and surrendered. Tecumseh and his men, though, refused to give up. A cavalry charge was stopped by a volley from the muskets of the indigenous warriors. The main force tried again, but the troops would get bogged down in the swamps. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted, and it was during this fighting that Tecumseh would be killed. As word of his death spread amongst the indigenous men, they started to fall back, and they too joined the retreat. The American victory all but crushed any resistance from the British in what is now Western Ontario. The area would remain relatively quiet for the rest of the war. The victory, though, did little to take away from the British successes in other Midwestern areas, and they still had nominal control of Illinois and Wisconsin, and would remain in control of those areas until the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. The Confederacy that Tecumseh had assembled would also fall apart without a strong leadership to guide it. As for Procter, he would eventually be court-martialed for his failures in the battle. He was charged with improper conduct and negligence. In December of 1814, he was sentenced to a suspension from rank and pay for 6 months. Tecumseh's name continues to live on through both myth and fact. Here in Canada, he is seen as a hero and a patriot, although this does downplay his actual aim of protecting indigenous lands in the United States from American encroachment. To this day, he is still honored here in Canada, named a person of national historic significance in 1931 by the federal government, and Tecumseh, Ontario, is named for him, as is the Naval Reserve Unit, the HMCS Tecumseh. As the British were licking their wounds after the defeat along the Thames, the Americans were preparing for an offensive into Lower Canada, or what is now Quebec. the U.S. Secretary of War, John Armstrong Jr., drew up a plan to capture Montreal. The thought was if they could take that city, Upper Canada would fall. The plan called for a force to move up the St. Lawrence River from Sackett's Harbor, with a second force to start out from Plattsburgh and go up Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River. One of the American leaders was Major General Wade Hampton. He commanded the forces at Plattsburgh, but he wasn't all that sure about the plan. His men were all raw recruits and were ill-supplied. The British controlled Lake Champlain, so it made it difficult for the supplies to reach Plattsburgh, and the Americans were also unable to build their own naval forces on the lake. In charge of the forces at Sackett's Harbor was Major General James Wilkinson, and he and Hampton hated each other. They had been at odds with each other since well before the war had even started. Technically, Wilkinson was in charge of the operation, but Hampton refused to accept orders from him. This, again, such a common theme for the Americans throughout the War of 1812. Officers refusing to obey orders of those who were of higher rank, even if nominally, due to perceived slights or thinking the person of higher rank was of lower social status. And this was the case for Hampton. He was a wealthy plantation owner from the South. Armstrong himself had to intervene, moving his offices to Sackett's Harbor and establishing that all correspondence regarding the upcoming expedition was to go through his hands. The Americans started to move out on September 19th. They went from Burlington, Vermont to Plattsburgh. There they decided that there would be too much resistance from the British who were garrisoned at Ile-aux-Noix. Instead, Hampton marched his men west to Four Corners on the Chateauguay River. Hampton would wait there until the 18th of October. The delay was due to preparations being behind for the column that was under the command of Wilkinson. Hearing that Wilkinson was almost ready to set out, Hampton moved out himself down the Chateauguay River. When they reached the border, American militiamen from New York chose to not advance any further. This was something that a militia force could do without repercussion. They had signed up to defend their home, not go on the offensive. This depleted Hampton's force by around 1,400 men, and he was left with 2 brigades of regulars, along with 200 cavalry and 10 field guns. The advance would move on, but went slowly, as all the bridges along the way had been destroyed and trees littered the road, deliberately felled to slow any advance. This was because the British knew an attack was coming. In command of the forces at Montreal was Major General Louis de Watteville. He had called up several militia units once he learned of an American advance. 2 battalions of the Royal Marines were also moved from Quebec to Montreal. The Governor General of Canada, Lieutenant General George Prevost, ordered Lieutenant Colonel George Macdonnell, the hero of Prescott, to bring up the 1st Light Battalion. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Salaberry, the Canadian-born commander of the Canadian Voltigeurs, had been organizing the defenses, taking advantage of the intelligence he had in the area, thanks to informants along the Chateauguay River. The road that Hampton was using to move along the river had a number of obstacles, such as those felled trees, and there was also a company of the Canadian Fencibles, 2 companies of the Voltigeurs, a company from the Beauharnois militia, and around 24 indigenous warriors. A mile behind this setup, the 2nd and 3rd battalions of the Select Embodied Militia were guarding a ford across the river. Then another 5 companies of the Voltigeurs, the main body of the 2nd Select Embodied Militia, around 200 other militiamen, and about 150 Mohawk warriors were in reserve positions behind that. The forces under de Salaberry's command were all from Lower Canada. The Fencibles were regulars, but were only for service in North America. The Voltigeurs were volunteers only in name, trained just as well as the regulars of the British Army, and the Select Embodied Militia were all chosen by draft for a year's service. These were men who were ready for battle, and one was coming. On October 25th, Hampton sent some of his men, around 1,500, under the command of Colonel Purdy to the ford to establish a crossing from the north bank of the Chateauguay to the south. The goal was to circle around the Canadian position. The remainder of the force would then move up under Brigadier General George Izard to attack from the other side. Just after Purdy set off, after he was too far gone to be effectively called back, Hampton received a letter. Armstrong had opted to relinquish command of the attack, and Wilkinson was now in charge of the expedition to take Montreal. Hampton was also ordered to construct winter quarters for 10,000 men along the St. Lawrence. Hampton thought this meant the attack on Montreal was being called off, but it was too late to call back Purdy's men. While he thought sticking around would be useless, he couldn't abandon Purdy. Meanwhile, Purdy's advance force found themselves in a miserable situation. It is late October, and they were marching through swampy woods in the rain. And they were completely lost, thanks to guides who really had no idea where they were going. The morning of October 26th saw the Americans finally on the right trail. Then just after noon, they encountered the first detachment from De Salaberry, the one posted to guard the fort. Americans had no idea what they were up against. The battle commenced. The 3rd Selected Embodied Militia opened fire at the fort, while units on the other side of the river also opened fire on the Americans. The advance was pushed back. The Americans attempted to regroup and attack again after the Canadians withdrew to deal with their wounded. The second effort was stymied as well, with more fire coming from the other bank of the river. While this was happening, the body of troops under the command of Izard approached through a ravine. They would use rolling volleys into the trees against the Canadians, which were useless in the terrain. Meanwhile, the Canadians were just firing aimed shots individually. On the right side of the Canadian line, the Americans were finally able to outflank the Fencibles, and that is when Macdonnell acted. Now, it isn't known to this day if this was done on his own initiative or not, but his men advanced. They used bugles and war cries to unnerve the Americans. The Americans were outmanned, outgunned, outflanked. They started to fall back, and fell back 3 miles. Turns out, there was no advance that was about to outflank them. De Salaberry had sent buglers into the woods to sound an advance, using the ruse de guerre to make Americans think they were about to be in a lot more trouble than they were. No matter what they did, though, the Americans kept coming under fire from the Canadians. They were finally back into the woods from where they had started the day. They would spend another night in the woods before finally falling back to where Hampton was set up. The casualty rolls showed 2 Canadians killed in action, 16 wounded and 4 missing. The Americans had 23 men killed in action, 33 wounded, 16 taken prisoner, and 29 missing. After the American withdrawal, Hampton held a council of war. The officers determined that there was no chance for success. The weather itself was playing a factor. It made the roads impassable. A withdrawal back to Four Corners was called for, and word was sent to Wilkinson about the situation. As for Wilkinson, he had reached a town called Hogues, a few miles up the St. Lawrence from Ogdensburg. While there, he received the word of the defeat at the Chateauguay. He issued an order to Hampton to advance on Cornwall. When Hampton received these orders, though, he thought it was more prudent to withdraw back to Plattsburgh, and sent word to Wilkinson that that was his plan. Before the reply could reach Wilkinson, though, he would suffer his own defeat at Chrysler's Farm near Morrisburg. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we will look at what could be considered the winter of discontent for those who lived along the Niagara River. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden stories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.